Hello, I'm Charles Mallet with a UK column interview, and today I have with me Shaz Khan, who has recently written The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline. And my opener to Shaz is going to be to say, well, Shaz, we live in an age of the prerequisite for almost any sort of discussion, debate, question or answer is that the person need be an expert. Now, you're not an immunologist or a vaccinologist or an epidemiologist or any of the above or below. You are not, in this particular regard, considered an expert. Why does that make you a suitable person to be looking into a subject like this?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Charles. But first of all, I never planned on looking into this subject, to be quite honest. I mean, as you said, I'm no expert. I don't work in the field of science or in medicine. I've always been interested in science, and through my work in marketing and communications for the last 20 years, it's come up often that we've used scientific language to sell products because it sounds good. But I basically got into this 10 years ago following my father's death, which I believe was provoked by a flu jab. Obviously, I'll never have any way of proving it, but it just got me asking questions. And I knew nothing about vaccines at that point, and I came from a pretty neutral standpoint where I believed what I was told as well in school, which is vaccines save lives. They saved us from smallpox and polio. But in the last 10 years, I can say I've spent well over 10,000 hours looking into this subject. And I've been looking in libraries and the National Archives, not just on Google or on the internet. There were a lot of books that I read in the beginning. I think the first one I read was Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Bystrionic. And to be quite frank, there were a lot of things in there I really had difficulty believing. And that's why I went to the libraries and to the National Archives, because I just was a bit astounded by the fact that we could have been lied to on such a massive scale. So I never intended to write a book when I started research. It was really just a personal project. But the more I came across outrageous documents within the National Archives, the more I said to myself, this has to be documented and has to be shared with the public so that they can see what the government documents say, which are buried in the National Archives. I mean, they're in the public domain, so anyone can get access to them. But I got access to documents through Freedom of Information requests. So documents from the 70s and the early 80s. And I think they're often closed for 100 years. So we still have to ask for more recent stuff. But I would say I'm absolutely not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert, but I have spent, as I said, well over 10,000 hours on this issue. I don't have any skin in the game. I'm not even a parent. So this isn't even like an issue, do I vaccinate my kids or not? It really was just following what happened to my father and then just being a geek about it and being shocked and outraged by what I discovered.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the way in which you went about sourcing and going through all the information that you refer to is something I definitely want to come back to, because I think that in itself is a fascinating story. And now what I would like to go into, although obviously a challenging and emotional subject, but I think the specifics around what it was that you believe did lead up to your father's death and how it was dealt with, I think are very crucial to your story and indeed your further investigation. Would you mind just going over what did happen and how it was, as you say, with an open mind, that you started to consider what you did consider?
Of course. So I'm based here in Switzerland, but my father was in the UK under the NHS system. To be quite honest, I was estranged from my father, so I hadn't spoken to him in a while. But I found out from a family friend that he was in hospital and he was seriously ill. So I rushed over to the UK to go and see him. So I had no idea that he'd received a flu vaccine at this point. I just knew that he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, non-smoker. He was a pretty relatively healthy guy, 70 years old. And within 24 hours of being admitted to hospital, he lost the ability to speak and he lost the ability to walk. So it was a very, very quick downslide. And it was only after he passed away, which was literally 4 weeks after I went to see him in hospital, which is when he was admitted. So he died on the 4th of February, 2015. I found out from my stepmom that in November he'd received a flu vaccination. Now, didn't know anything about vaccines, but in my understanding, you don't give vaccines to people who are sick. So if you died of stage 4 lung cancer at the beginning of February, chances are you would have been sick in November and shouldn't have received a vaccine. I didn't know exactly what brand he got, so I just looked at all the package inserts that I could find, and I was quite horrified to find out that it's acknowledged that there are neurological reactions following the flu vaccine. And what didn't add up with my dad and why I started asking questions is when he was in hospital with stage 4 lung cancer, he didn't have any respiratory issues. He didn't have any breathing issues. He only had neurological issues and inflammation in the brain, which for me, again, Again, I'm no expert, but for me, if someone's got stage 4 lung cancer, they have trouble breathing. I've seen another friend of mine with a father who was a chain smoker, had stage 4 lung cancer, and he had problems breathing. But my dad had none of that. It was all neurological. And when I did discover it, the package inserts themselves declare that neurological side effects from flu vaccines are known and acknowledged, I was pretty shocked. And obviously, we know the NHS UK system. You get, 5-10 minutes with your GP if you're lucky. So if you do go in there with a cough and you say you're not feeling good and it's the season of the flu, what are they going to do if you're over 65 is give you the flu vaccine. No questions, no real delving into what else is going on. And 5-10 minutes is really not enough to have a consultation with your GP. So that was his situation. And as I said, I have no proof. We'll never have any proof that that did. But since I have been speaking out about the flu vaccine, I've been quite, it's quite interesting to notice that a lot of people have stories around the flu vaccine, either getting super sick afterwards or, transmitting the flu to other people. The flu vaccine, I spoke a lot to hairdressers because I believe that they have a lot of gossip in the neighborhood. And believe me, when you bring up the question of flu vaccine, I've had people in the back room who just heard flu vaccine and totally perked up and had a story to share where they all said basically that they'd never get another flu vaccine because it made them more sick than they had ever been. So anyhow, I digress, but that was the reason why I basically started looking into vaccines. Because as I said, I had no knowledge. But I had a lot of friends who were having children at the time, and I noticed that they were sick a lot, and it just kind of was strange because I don't remember being, like when I was a child of the late 70s, sorry, and I don't remember kids being that sick. I mean, I had the measles, I had chicken pox, I didn't have mumps, but I remember those childhood diseases, and I remember the parties you would get them all infected whilst they're young, and it just didn't make sense that nowadays kids have got all these strange allergies, chronic diseases, ADHD, asthma. So yeah, that basically started the journey 10 years ago. And here I am with a book now that I've try to put it in a documented form, because there are lots of books on vaccines. There really are. But I found that on the historical level, apart from Dissolving Illusions, there weren't that many that really delved into the history of it, and from a perspective of what we found in government archives and also catalogs. Like, I had no idea that back in the early 20th century we had vaccines against acne, against pneumonia already. We did have some flu vaccines against influenza, but they were bacterial based because we still didn't have the understanding of viral disease at that point. And I was quite shocked. I was really naive. I was very naive when I started my journey. So but yeah, so that obviously this personal story, like for many others, is what drove me to start researching more.
Yeah, I mean, obviously awful that those were the circumstances that did cause you to start looking that way in the first place. That's the conclusion you arrived at. As you say, not only will you never be able to prove it, but I sincerely doubt that anybody on the other side of the fence would try to do anything that would suggest that you were right, as in any of the medics, any of the pharmaceutical companies. It is, of course, well documented that hospitals do prescribe or incorrectly prescribe medications. There are an awful lot of things that go wrong in hospitals. Were there other things that you looked at in addition to the flu vaccine, or sort of alongside it, or was it, in a way, the sort of the blindingly obvious standout thing that had happened?
Well, at the time, as I said, I didn't know he'd received a flu vaccine when he was in hospital. So my interest in health in general did start in 2009, so before his passing. And I was very much learning about nutrition and understanding how much nutrition can help our health issues, help my health issues. So when he was in hospital, I did know about cancers, like try to avoid giving him sugar. The NHS system, again, very good people trying to do the best they can with a broken system. But he was in a cancer ward where basically there was people with jaundice and people incredibly sick in his ward, and they were passing out white bread sandwiches with ham and cheese and white tea and coffee, like the worst things you can possibly serve people who were trying to get better and heal. So at the time, my brother and I, who were both quite annoying for the doctors, I think, is we put like signs on my dad's bed, like, you know, no sugar, no white flour, try to avoid any inflammatory foods, etc. And doctor basically kind of made us out to look like we're crazy. But he did actually get a little bit better at one point, to where they almost proposed chemotherapy, but then they kind of backtracked and said they weren't going to offer him anything but just hospice care. So as I didn't know during the whole time he was in hospital, I really learned, I think, at the funeral when we were sitting around the table with my stepmom and my half sister, and we were trying to understand what had happened and how he'd gone down so quickly. And then my stepmom said, "Yeah, I don't know why he got that flu jab. He never gets the flu jab. I don't know why he got that flu jab." And I was just like, "What?" Because my dad was Indian, was one of those who never went to the doctor. He was quite a stubborn man, and had old, you know, formulas for when he did get sick. So he really did rarely go to the doctor. And it was very surprising for his wife and for me that he would go and get a flu jab. But there you go. That's what happens when you only have 5-10 minutes, and that's all the doctor offers you, and you're looking for help.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, of course, only anecdotal, but the coincidence of people who have lived long, healthy lives who have also said that they've never had any interaction with the medical establishment is one that really can't be ignored. However, it's so difficult to explain that, especially to a health service, as you say, who feeds apparently sort of on loop exactly the things you describe, you know, white bread and sugar. I mean, the idea that the National Health Service really has anything to do with health in the genuine sense is I would say, totally inaccurate. Now, you've talked about your book, what sets it apart, and I think, especially in the last 5 years, the subject of vaccination has become an incredibly hot, divisive, and very sensitive topic. But to go back to where we perceive it all started, where do you go back to? And I mean, sort of, first of all, in the medical sense, but then, of course, all importantly, in the commercial sense. And are those two different things?
That's an interesting question, because the commercial aspect, I didn't realize, already started at the end of the 19th century. We had a lot of vaccines on the market, and back in the days, there were absolutely no regulations. There was absolutely no, you know, kind of licensing that you needed even to put a product on the market. So I believe in 1910 already. I mean, in the US, they already had that Biologics Act that came into place in 1902 as a result, actually, of injury following vaccine campaigns, but it still wasn't a sure thing. In the UK, it was harder to find actual legislation on how they were controlling the quality and the purity of products they put on the market, but there were products on the market basically. So the commercial aspect has basically started already since the beginning of end of 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Definitely was accelerated in the mid 20th century with, I would say, biotech industries, with the fact that we could be much more sophisticated in the development of vaccines. And of course, as we all know, in the US, what was a huge factor for them was the 1986 Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, which essentially allowed vaccines to be brought to market and the manufacturers had no liability. So as before, the financial incentives were pretty low because there wasn't much market for profit. And then what profit they were making was getting eaten up by lawsuits of people who were filing damages, because there were a lot of damages, especially after the DTP vaccine. That was the one that had the highest insurance because it was the most reported to have neurological damage and serious neurological damage, where they were paying out millions. So after this 1986 Act, even though in Europe we didn't have the same legislation, it seemed to influence how manufacturers in Europe were also given this type of liability. I mean, in Switzerland, it was covered under the epidemics law. So any vaccine that came out is automatically kind of covered on the epidemics law, and automatically there is no liability by the manufacturer unless you can prove that the product is defective or that there was an intent to create a dangerous product, which anybody will know is incredibly hard to prove. I mean, you need discovery in the first place to be able to go through all the documents from the pharmaceutical industry, and that's not really done anymore, especially since this 1986 Act. But the commercial aspect is over 100 years old. And I would just say that it accelerated, I would say, in the mid-20th century with the polio vaccine, which was probably the first that we had such a media hype around. And that kind of I would say, how do you say, it? Instilled this idea that vaccines save us from disease, save us from these infections. And it was so mediatized and like worldwide, everyone who knew who Salk was. It's the first time that anyone really knew what a scientist, I don't think there's any other scientist who's had so much, or maybe Einstein, but then here in Switzerland, he was half Swiss. So anyway, I digress, sorry. But I would believe that it's definitely the mid 20th century, then with these liabilities that were given, well, liability free, sorry, that was given to the pharmaceutical industry. And then biotech industry, when it came into the 70s, the 80s, that allowed a huge amount of innovation to be created around vaccines based on genetic engineering, because now we were able to go and tinkle with the actual genetic code of these viruses and of bacteria and create genetically modified organisms. And then the first hepatitis B, which was based on a genetically modified organism and came out in 1986. And that basically just their patents, the amount of money they can make, that changed everything for the pharmaceutical industry who are making vaccines. There was a lot more profit to be made. And here today is where we stand, where we're still in that, and it's obviously been accelerated with this whole mRNA technology, which they say they want to now use that for the flu vaccine. They're looking into it for other diseases. I've even seen an mRNA acne vaccine in progress through Sanofi. So this allows them to make more money with the patents, with the the exchange of intellectual property. Sorry. And yeah, that's where we're at the moment. So if we don't kind of like step back and make sure that the authorities actually recognize the injuries already, which is one of the big problems we're having here, we're going to move forward to this absolute, I would say, explosion of genetic products that are sold as, vaccines, but they're not vaccines by how we understand them, because they change definitions. And that's something I've also seen in the research, which has been very instrumental, is the changing definitions of diseases, of names, the changing of definition of immunity. All these influence how we perceive this market of vaccines and in the protection against infectious disease, which is ultimately what it's supposed to be about.
Yeah, well, that's exactly. I mean, there's so many things to pull out of that, your response just there. But I think the one that we should go into is the terminology. What was the what was the vaccination for in the first place? And of course, the approved sort of narrative version is Edward Jenner with cowpox and this sort of suggestion that illness could be transmitted from one being to another, which is something, again, that was a novel concept, and there's still huge controversy surrounding that very issue today. But now we are in an era where it seems that there are vaccines for absolutely everything. And you've just referred to an acne vaccine. I don't know if anyone's ever suggested that's transmissible from person to person, but we go back to this thing of, well, what actually is it, and what is vaccination? And of course, then the other thing, that the delivery method. I mean, interesting when you talk about the National Health Service and what they feed to people, and this sort of this step away from nature. Of course, in nature, anything that penetrates or punctures the skin is doing harm. Whether it be a sea urchin or a porcupine or a thorn, they're trying to do harm. And yet we've accepted that we should receive something that's meant to be beneficial in the same method. I mean, that might be something sort of outside where you've looked, but it is just interesting to note that that is how we actually receive until now. I know there are ways in which this is going to change, but let's just go back to the sort of the Jenner period and the whole idea, vaccination or inoculation. I mean, what actually is it? What's it meant to be?
Well, it's interesting because in many ways it kind of resembles homeopathy, and people might like their ears perk up when I say that. But there was also homeoprophylaxis, which was understood as you're giving the information of the disease in a controlled manner, in a tiny dose, to inform the body in a controlled manner, in a small dose, so that they can build up an immunity when they're next exposed to it. So, I mean, that's the concept of vaccines, basically, as we understand it. But that's also kind of the concept of homeopathy, homeoprophylaxis, at least. But obviously people will laugh and say, well, there's nothing in homeopathy, you can't measure anything, etc., because the information is so small. Anyway, but we can discuss about how limited science is by what they can and cannot measure. But vaccination in the day of Jenner was obviously not in an injection because they didn't even have syringes back then. It was, it was a scrape into the arm usually. So you scrape an open wound and you kind of put the pus in, and nobody really knows what was used as vaccines in the early days. Even scholars who have spent like their whole professional career trying to understand exactly what was used, they don't know. So we think it's cowpox. It's also horse grease. So you can imagine how unsafe it was and how unsanitary, because back in those days, we obviously didn't have sanitation, we didn't have disinfectant, we didn't have antibiotics. So a lot of things we didn't have that people seem to forget back in the days that vaccination came to life. It was a dangerous, risky procedure in itself, and yet still it was mandated, and we still didn't understand how it worked. So fast forward to Pasteur, for instance, who was the next big, let's say, vaccinologist, shall we say, who developed the rabies vaccine famously. I mean, the whole Pasteur Institute came about because of rabies vaccination. It was basically a place to go get a rabies vaccine. That's how it started. Obviously, they had chicken cholera vaccine. They also developed anthrax vaccines, but they weren't very much used, and those were primarily for animals. And then we had the toxoid vaccines that came along. And it wasn't until about the 1940s, 1950s that we started doing the systematic kind of mass-producing plastic syringe-based vaccination campaigns. There was a jet injector, which was much cheaper and was easier as well to do the typical vaccine campaigns in Africa, where you just want to, jab them like they're cattle, basically. And it's interesting that nowadays, when you look at the literature, they're really trying to focus on oral vaccinations, like rotavirus is oral, typhoid at one point was oral, if I'm not mistaken, and use the mucosal immunity, because they realize that injecting into a muscle is not actually putting the viral information where it needs to go, where you can build up an immunity, which is usually the mucosal lining of your intestines, your stomach, your respiratory system. So they're looking more into mucosal vaccines. And it's interesting about mRNA, because mRNA was looked initially as a hopeful solution for cancer patients, which admittedly, cancer patients are already sick. Some of them have no other options. So when you're talking about an mRNA vaccine or product inoculation for potentially terminal disease, I think they should be doing the research. And I think it's great that they were using that. But then to flip it and say we're going to use it for infectious diseases in healthy people, knowing that the first human clinical trial for an infectious disease using mRNA technology was in 2014 by CureVac in Germany, only on 101 people, and the results at the end of 2017 weren't even that favorable. To 4 years later, to go and put that en masse on people, including children and pregnant women, is just crazy. But yeah, I mean, we have different types of vaccines. We have oral vaccines. Now they're talking about the needle-free vaccines, where it's like a patch. Animals, they get sprayed. They have aerosol vaccines, because obviously it's not always so practical to inject every single one of them. So you can spray a vaccine into the air, and then through the respiratory system, the animals will absorb it. I mean, in France, in Europe, sorry, I'm not sure about in the UK if it's passed as well, but there's the first self-amplifying mRNA vaccine, which has been permitted, called Kostiav, which is really concerning, because the mRNA is designed to self-amplify in the body. So you don't actually know when is there an off switch? Does it stop creating those toxic proteins that then your antibodies are supposed to develop a response against? So it's quite concerning. But the technology itself, and I would say the philosophy itself of vaccination is it makes sense. But where we've gone with it, we've turned it into this massive market. We don't look at health anymore as an outcome. We just look at these surrogate markers, which are these antibody levels in the blood, or sometimes your T cell levels. But we don't really have better health as a result, in my opinion. And I can see this when I look at kids around me who are vaccinated.
I think that's the thing. That is what I'd like to just go back into, because a lot of people will be familiar with the graphs that show the decline in smallpox, and that those are always presented by people who are trying to demonstrate that vaccination against smallpox worked. And those that are looking at it perhaps in a different way would say, yeah, but if you look at where the vaccine came in, the decline in smallpox incidences, and I do caveat this with, of course, that all statistics can be manipulated any which way, but nonetheless, it's very easy to demonstrate with a graph, depending on where you start it, that yes, the smallpox vaccine absolutely did away with smallpox, or the smallpox vaccine came in at a time where changes to hygiene, sanitation, nutrition, all sorts of other factors came in and made it look like the vaccine may have played a part, or indeed made it look like the vaccine made absolutely no difference, or indeed created harm when none had previously existed. Where do you sort of fall on that particular issue?
Well, this is interesting because there were lots of scientific experts back in the days already who were highlighting the issues with smallpox vaccination and the manipulation of statistics, especially in the UK, again, definitions are very important here because you can usually the most reliable statistics are mortality statistics, but still, it depends on the definition of certain diseases. I mean, if you change the definition of a disease, then that's going to affect your statistics. And I've noticed that's kind of like a playbook thing that is happening a lot, especially with measles and polio. But anyway, smallpox vaccination was already highlighted as being an issue with this, how the statistics were held, the fact that if they knew someone, because with smallpox, you could tell if someone had received a vaccine because they usually had a scar. So they would be more inclined to diagnose something that looked like smallpox, but because the person had a scar to prove that they had received inoculation against smallpox, they'd call it something else. So there was a lot of that. And in the book that I have put in about 50 years worth of eminent scientists and doctors who highlight these issues with the way statistics were held. Alfred Wallace is one of the main ones who spoke out publicly and then who was ridiculed. That's the same playbook as well that we see today. Anybody who does speak out against the orthodoxy is ridiculed. They discredit it and basically try to ignore all their previous accomplishments scientifically. There were many, Charles Creighton is another example who was asked to write the entry of the British Encyclopedia at the end of the 19th century. And when he investigated and did a deep dive, he was again shocked to discover there was a lot of manipulation, a lot of also financial interest because vaccinators were making money for every injection that they gave. And he wrote that in the British Encyclopedia. I mean, they changed that entry a few years later, and he was discredited as well, despite being a very eminent epidemiologist. So you see this already like over 100 years ago. So it's really, history repeats itself. So until we break the cycle of this repeating itself, we're going to continue. Because if you think in the 1800s that eminent scientists already weren't being listened to and were already highlighting problems with the smallpox vaccination and saying it wasn't the smallpox vaccine that reduced smallpox. I mean, the WHO says it was eradicated in the end of the 1970s. That would be after like over 100 years of use. How practical and useful is this vaccine that takes over 100 years of several doses? Because it wasn't just 1 or 2 doses. It was, people that had received up to 7, 8, 9 doses in a lifetime. And every time there was an epidemic, they said, you have to get revaccinated. You have to get revaccinated. How useful is a vaccine if it takes that long to get rid of the disease? And then you're not taking into consideration the fact, yeah, we had better sanitation. Yeah, we had antibiotics. Yeah, we had better living conditions and working conditions. And there was something else with the smallpox vaccine was interesting. It was already in the end of the 19th century. The symptoms of variola, there was variola minor and variola major. And variola major was the one that had a high mortality rate up to 30%. And then variola minor, which is the one that was already predominant in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, had a lower mortality rate. And it was called alastrim, which I believe was the Portuguese named it that. So already at that time, smallpox was way less serious. What it was, unfortunately, was it could be disfiguring. It could, for especially a woman, you'd leave pox scars. So yeah, and it was inconvenient. And yeah, there was always a risk for children. But it wasn't the same deadly disease it was like a century before that, because of various factors. Also, as I said, working conditions were better, sanitation was getting better. So all that had its influence as well. And often I would say vaccines take credit for, or they try to take credit for other changes, notably the introduction of antibiotics or the introduction of certain sanitary practices. And I remind anybody listening, here in Switzerland, our public health office was called the Office of Public Hygiene up until 1975, and then it changed its name to the Office of Public Health. And I think that was actually quite telling, that change.
It's very telling. And this strikes to the heart of, I think, so much of the environment surrounding this nowadays, which is that people are, by and large, utterly unaware of what you're describing, the history, even going back a couple of decades. People have just been slowly but steadily brainwashed by the incredible media campaigns that get pumped out surrounding all of these sort of vaccination initiatives. And in actual fact, what I'd just like to go back to is in the UK, the Vaccination Act of 1853, which mandated the smallpox vaccine on all infants. I think there are things like that that are completely forgotten. And when you talk about breaking the cycle, and we see now, of course, that with the commercial interests since, say, the beginning of the 20th century, which you describe, alongside that, of course, a responsible government says, oh, no, don't worry, it's fine, we'll regulate it. And again, okay, well, how will you do that? Well, we'll set up an agency that's funded by the manufacturers of the products and then see what they say. So, here in the UK, we have the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency. I've missed out the medical devices, but the MHRA. And I mean, but by any description, I mean, that is corrupt. I mean, the way in which it's done is absolutely corrupt. There's no possible way that they can give an objective view on it. And with that in mind, and also the process of sort of so-called emergency authorizations and whatnot, how do you envisage a way in which the cycle can be broken, either insofar as mass vaccination campaigns are sort of stopped, or that people just have a better idea of what's going on?
I think it's going to be a bit of both. And I think obviously during COVID, we saw that because, as you said, in 1853, when they wanted to mandate they did mandate the smallpox vaccine on I believe it was, they had to be in the first year of life vaccinated. That's what triggered the anti-vaccine movement back in the days. That's what triggered all these groups, these parents, these scientists who got together and said, hey, we're not having that. And they managed to, I mean, it took a while, but they did manage to get it revoked, and repealed, or at least have conscientious objection, and forced the government under the guise of the Royal Commission to do an investigation into the injuries following and deaths following the smallpox vaccine. So the fact that they pushed the public into between a rock and a hard place is what actually encouraged people to start speaking out and informing other people. And the same thing with kind of COVID. Like here in Switzerland, I'm working with a group of medical professionals who before COVID never questioned any vaccines. And because of what they did with COVID, we never had mandates here in Switzerland, but there was definitely coercion. Because of that, they now question the whole schedule, and they question the safety of all of them because of what the government did with COVID. So it really kind of backfired, I would say, by them trying to push this vaccine. And they did, I mean, they were successful on getting it onto billions of people. They've eroded trust in public institutions in a major way. So that's already, I would say, something encouraging in the sense that people now are asking questions, and that's going to maybe hopefully avoid the situation ever happening again next time there's a pandemic. And the health institutions have less trust. I mean, it would be interesting to see what happens in the US with Kennedy, what he's trying to do, what the influence on Europe is going to be, because at the moment it's just Kennedy is a crazy anti-vaxxer, and anything he does in the US isn't taken seriously, to be quite honest. Is the perception I see here in Switzerland. And yeah, I mean, in the UK, there are no vaccines which are obligatory, and the same in Switzerland. In the States, they have it different. It is mandated for school attendance. But in the UK and in Switzerland, consumers also now have a choice. It's like, if we don't want to take a product, we have a choice to say no. And then if enough of us stand up, they can't push us, because what are they going to fill up their jails with all of us? I mean, they can't do that. They can try to fine us, which is what they did, I believe, in Austria, but they had to again stand down with the fines because it didn't pass. There were way too many people who were revolting against it, and people who did get fines were just simply immediately contesting them. I mean, we got fines here in Switzerland if you're walking around without a mask, but no one got fined if you didn't get a vaccine. Like, I think in Austria it was even up to 500 euros. So it was ridiculous, but it didn't last long. They tried. They really are trying in any way possible to coerce people into this. But by coercing, they've done more damage, because now there's way more trust issues within the medical establishment. I can tell you there are lots of doctors I know who will not touch another vaccine for themselves, for their family, or even for their patients. I mean, they have to be very careful, because here, I guess, like in most places, if a patient denounces their doctor saying, hey, my doctor suggested I shouldn't get the flu vaccine because it's not effective, which, I mean, I went to Oxford University and they said that themselves, then a doctor could potentially get into trouble. because he's not following the official health recommendations. But I think we also need to allow doctors to go through the potential repercussions that they might get from the health authorities, because they realize if they go all the way to the end, if they make it and they stay in their course, the government hasn't got much to prove that vaccines really are safe and effective and the best way to prevent infection, especially not for the flu. I mean, the flu is... I went to Oxford University for a vaccinology course back in October 2019, and I didn't actually remember and recall, but I had Neil Ferguson as one of the teachers. So the famous statistician from Imperial College. Now, pretty much everyone I spoke to admitted the flu vaccine was 30% effective if you're lucky. And I kind of was standing there going, but why are we pushing this on the medical professionals? Like here in Switzerland, if you don't get a flu vaccine, they make you wear a mask. And then anyone who does have a flu vaccine is get their little, their virtue signaling badge saying, I've got the flu vaccine, when in case they actually could potentially be transmitting it more easily because the vaccine is not effective. Anyhow, sorry. But why are we giving it to pregnant women? And the answer was, it's better than nothing. And for me, health, I mean, that's just showing that they just want to push products on people. It's not about health, because sometimes doing nothing is better than pushing an experimental, not so effective product that hasn't actually really been monitored in pregnant women over the long term. And neither has the pertussis vaccine, which we get to pregnant women. And I've just checked now, there's a fourth one, Abrevio, which is being also pushed on pregnant women from 28 weeks in the UK and in Switzerland to prevent against RSV. Pregnant women are being bombarded by vaccines. It makes no sense. But again, the people's power is what is, I think, the most important. People do not forget you have the choice to say yes or no. And if anybody is pushing you into it, like an employer, get him to sign a sheet saying that he will take responsibility for any side effects or any problems that you have as a result, which is what some people did during COVID, and their employers backed off.
Yeah, I mean, that was a dire period for a lot of people for all sorts of different reasons, actually. Even the people that did believe there was a sort of existential threat presented by a novel illness or not, whichever way you looked at it, the changes that were made to people's lives en masse were almost universally awful. And one of the things that's come out of that is, like you say, there are a lot of people who are within the medical profession who have, in effect, had their eyes opened, they've turned their backs on this, that, and the other. But there are also a lot of people who have, in effect, doubled down. And the language that's being used around this particular issue and continues to be used by the media, if you exactly like you say, you've got this suggestion that a pregnant woman should take something because it's better than nothing. I mean, this is pretty much the weakest argument you could possibly make when the outcome could be death. But sort of associated with that, we see language like, if you don't take a vaccine, it's not just that you don't take it, you've refused it or you're hesitant about it. Now, that is always run alongside certainly in the UK, vaccination campaigns that make absolutely no allusion to the possibility that any of this could be harmful. The current NHS campaign for autumn vaccines is called Stay Stronger. All the imagery they use on social media features cartoon characters. And it's always it's a parent with a child, as though, exactly like you say, with the sort of white bread and sugar thing, as though, yeah, well, it's just going to make you healthy, isn't it? Because what I'm getting to is that the medical profession is part of it. But of course, all of this is actually sewn up by media and by advertising. Have you seen a change in the wind direction as far as media are concerned, or are they just too closely enmeshed with the pharmaceutical companies?
I guess it depends what media you're looking at. I mean, I look at the equivalent of the BBC here in Switzerland, which is the RTS, which is also kind of like state-controlled and paid by the taxpayer. It seems like they're getting desperate. So the messaging, like we have our association, we usually didn't bother making complaints against the press because we noticed that there actually wasn't much consequence, and it would take like 2 years before you would get a decision. And by that time, people have forgotten what you were talking about, so it made no point. But we've noticed, especially during the World Immunization Week in April of this year, there was a lot of disinformation that came out of our mainstream media. And we actually called them out on it. And I mean, it's again a slow process, but we're going through the process of calling them out because we don't think it's acceptable. They weren't transparent about the fact that it was basically promotion for the WHO during that World Immunization Week. They were, scaring the population against polio, scaring the population against measles, using all these scare tactics to try and also saying that basically people who are hesitant against vaccines are responsible for the increase in disease. So you're also creating kind of like a hate and a discrimination against a certain group of people. So I think they're making mistakes because they're going too far. And they're being, I think for me, it seems like I see it as a positive thing because it's desperation and going to the point of actually being completely dishonest with your public, which is also going to further erode public confidence, is a proof to me that they don't have much else. They don't really have science on their side. They don't really have the arguments on the side, hence why they have to use fear. I have to laugh because, sorry, I was looking at my collection the other day, and I actually have a Peppa Pig Gets Vaccinated book. Now, I know this is nothing to do with like a high level discussion, but for me, it showed how they're indoctrinating kids already from a young age. Like, and it said vaccines keep you healthy, and that was it. There was no other explanation, and that's not a scientific claim anyone can make because it's never been studied. Do vaccines really make us healthier? And that's the big question that Kennedy is trying to get to the bottom of in the US, because there's so much chronic disease. I mean, even here in Switzerland, we have a fantastic healthcare system, but yet we're opening hospitals specifically for children who have chronic diseases and cancer, autoimmune diseases, weird behavioral issues. So I think they're getting desperate because I think they're losing people. I mean, they still are the majority, of people who believe that vaccines are safe and effective and we should get all of them and trust our government authorities. But there are more and more, and I would say over 30%, maybe even 40, who are really, really not having any of it, and especially in France. And why is that? Because the government mandated 11 vaccines. After there was a petition from the people who were just asking them to take aluminum out of the vaccines, because Sanofi used to do vaccines, well, before it was called Sanofi, it was Institut Pasteur and Mérieux. They used to do vaccines with calcium phosphate as an adjuvant, which is still approved as an adjuvant, but nobody uses it. And because there was a petition to get aluminum out of some of the vaccines, especially like DTP, and the response was to make 11 vaccines obligatory and obviously leave aluminum in most of them, now France is one of the biggest vaccine hesitant countries in Europe. So it does backfire when the government tries to push on people. But I think the media, especially nowadays, is kind of running out of arguments. They're just using fear and ridicule. And that's the only thing that they have. That's the only arsenal, because they can't really address the actual scientific arguments that people who are questioning vaccines bring up. Like typically, why don't we use saline placebos? Why don't we do long-term studies? Why don't we do an unvaccinated versus vaccinated study? All these questions they don't really want to address, hence they use fear, and it's going to work against them, especially after COVID.
Yeah, one would hope so. Now, in the hope that there will be people listening to this who've come into it like you were years ago, sort of open-minded and haven't really thought one way or the other. Just quickly on aluminium and calcium phosphate, what are the issues with those two things?
So aluminum is probably the oldest, well, it is the oldest adjuvant that we've been using since the 1920s. It's used in the vaccines to basically bolster the immune response, because they noticed that often when they were trying to inject certain products, it wouldn't actually have any effects. So they needed something that they knew was inflammatory, which what aluminum is. And they used aluminum phosphate and aluminum hydroxide, principally in a DTP vaccine, hepatitis B, Prevnar. I mean, it's in lots of vaccines. But this is the aluminum salt that they used since the early days. Now, back in the 50s, I believe, 50s, 60s, in France, they obviously noticed that aluminum was creating some problems, and they were looking for other alternatives, other mineral-based adjuvants. And they looked at calcium phosphate. Calcium phosphate was used in France, manufactured by Mérieux, Institut Pasteur, sorry, and was used in their base vaccines. So the DTP polio, they have the triple DT polio, coqueluche, which is pertussis, was later combined, and it was a quite successful adjuvant. It was a little bit more expensive than aluminum, because aluminum is dirt cheap. So and again, forgive me, my memory is not exactly correct, but I believe it was when Institut Pasteur bought Mérieux, or the other way around, Mérieux bought Institut Pasteur, they saw that calcium phosphate was costing them more, and he decided to stop using it. So they went back to just using aluminum, because it's cheaper. And so that's why calcium phosphate was phased out of those French-produced vaccines. As far as I know, it wasn't produced in the US or in any other countries. But it was just a price issue. But today, as I said, still can be used by any manufacturer who decides they want to use a safer adjuvant, because it's an organic adjuvant that had less reactivity than aluminum, which we know is highly reactogenic. But it's a price thing, and that's often, unfortunately, many of the decisions are made based on prices. And for the DTP shot, those who know a little bit about the wholesale acellular discussion, that from the 90s we started using the acellular version because it was less reactogenic, and we abandoned the wholesale pertussis, which was really reactogenic, and probably why the DTP was getting so many lawsuits for neurological damage. They still use the wholesale DTP in Africa, in Asia, in South America. UNICEF still orders them and distributes them on a massive scale. So why are we using these more reactive vaccines in these countries? It's because they're cheaper. And obviously there's less surveillance in these developing nations, or low-income nations, as they call them now, low to middle income nations. But they shouldn't be allowed. I mean, sorry, I get really upset when I think about just the finance. Like, we're talking about pennies. And these pharmaceutical industry, obviously we know they make billions of dollars. I mean, Pfizer, Sanofi, Merck, GSK, they make billions. And people who say that vaccines don't make billions, I'm sorry, but that's not the case anymore. It used to be maybe before the 80s, but now they make billions. And obviously, Comirnaty, the COVID vaccine, has made over $86 billion for Pfizer in the space of 4 years. Prevnar has made about 80 billion as well since it's been released in 2000. Gardasil has made over $50 billion. And these are companies who don't have to pay out a penny for injury or damages. So it's, and plus the government markets their products and the government mandates their products in some countries.
Yeah. It is deeply shocking. And to the outsider, it is apparently so obvious when one scrapes it away. It is also something you're never going to read in Peppa Pig, because the propaganda campaign surrounding it is so well sort of packaged and delivered. But on that, on the finances, because let's just scrape away all the sort of apparent health benefits, whatever. It is about money. I mean, that is obvious to anyone who spent more than 5 minutes reading the instructions or the ingredients of a vaccine or what it may do, or indeed looking at any evidence of what it could do health-wise. It is about money. Now, this is going to be perhaps a difficult question to answer because I'm asking in a general sense, but whilst you've got the pharmaceutical companies run by people who are driven by a mania concerning profit above all else, and actually when one thinks, just on the returns one gets, I mean, Bill Gates is a very good example of somebody who's not shy about saying he's had a 20-fold return on his investment in vaccines. He giggles every time he says it, which is sort of repellent at the same time as being astonishing. But so you've got that tier of people who are driving the finances of the system and indeed greasing the skids where the regulatory agencies and bodies are concerned. But to make all of this happen, of course, you need people who are, at least in some capacity, sort of scientists or chemists, biologists. And is it at all plausible that none of them has any idea what's going on? I mean, we cite, let's consider Andrew Wakefield, for example, who did what he did because he went to have a look at something that he thought nobody else was having a look at. How are we to regard those people who are? I mean, there are many of them who make this happen. Should it be blindingly obvious to them that this is happening, or is there some mechanism by which they are completely sort of blinded or blindsided?
I think there are, unfortunately, a lot of people who are completely blinded and blindsided, and it's an ideological construct. I mean, I'm not even in the field, but it was hard for me to go through the process of realizing, oh crap, like what we've been told about vaccines, it's not true. Or, they've been hiding information. Someone who spent their whole career working in vaccinology, working on developing vaccines because they really want to help people. I mean, there are lots of people who work in pharma, who work in regulatory agencies, who even work for the WHO, who really are good people looking to make a difference, a positive difference, to help people. And it's incredibly, I can imagine, soul crushing to realize that, okay, maybe I was wrong. And there are some brave scientists who will leave the field because they're just completely disgusted. There are others who will just pretend it's not happening because they have a mortgage to pay, they have a kid in college, and all the rest of it. And there are some who believe what they're saying. They think that people who highlight injuries or problems after vaccines are crazy and need to be silenced. Now, is it because they're being so conditioned and brainwashed? Perhaps. I don't know. I mean, when I was in Oxford, again, it's interesting because I was the only non-scientist in the room, and I'm doing a course on vaccinology with PhD students, with scientists, with regulatory agent people, and Wakefield came up. And actually at a lunch table, I said, well, has anybody actually read, one, his original paper, and second, the lawsuit against him? And nobody had. And here I am sitting in a room with scientists, and they haven't even read the source document. They just base their opinion based on the media, based on what Brian Deere said in the Sunday Mail or whatever the Times. And nobody has gone to look at the actual paper because people are still saying that, oh, he said there was a connection between autism and vaccines. He never said that. He suggested a possible link that warranted further investigation. And that in itself, you're not allowed to say. I mean, I think the big mistake what pissed off the industry was when he went to the press conference and said, you should get the individual vaccines and not the MMR because we don't have enough safety data. I think that was what they didn't like, and hence why they pulled off the single vaccines off the market 6 months later. That wasn't Wakefield who did it. It was the pharmaceutical industry who took the choice away from parents. It's shocking to discover a lot of scientists don't actually read. They don't have time, or they don't have the interest, or they only want to read the abstract. They don't want to read the actual, the whole report. And yeah, I even had at that table when I was again in Oxford a PhD student ironically, who was working on the microbiota, who said, I'd rather have autism than measles. And my mouth dropped because on top of it, she told me she got the measles after she'd had the vaccine. So she'd had measles, she'd had the vaccine, and yet she was still standing there saying she'd rather have autism than measles. And I mean, she wasn't a parent at that point. She was too young. Well, she could have still had a kid, but anyway. But there are some ideas in people's head which just don't make any sense. And you have to ask, is it just because they're conditioned that way? It's because they want to make sure they stay in their lane? Because that's science, is publish or perish. It's unfortunately become in itself also corrupted by money, corrupted by interest. You have to stay in the lane if you want to get your funding, you want to get your grants, and you want to be acknowledged by your peers. I mean, I used to be really, have the imposter syndrome that I don't have a PhD or anything, and I'm still talking about a subject like this. But I've seen people with 2 PhDs who get absolutely discredited and completely dismounted because they're talking negatively or criticizing vaccines. It doesn't matter how much scientific clout you have, you're still going to get bashed down by those who are trying to protect the industry. There's a lot of money in it. I mean, if you look at the amount of vaccine conferences there are in the world, and now with the biotech industry, it's gigantic. You're probably talking about millions of people hired, from the factories to the developing scientists, to the distribution, to the marketing companies. It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And sorry, I may have lost a little bit the gist of the question, but I think it's an ideological construct that has to be a little bit broken with honesty and with truth, but it's going to be hard for some.
It absolutely is, and that's it. You articulate that sort of tsunami of pressure coming the other way, I think, very, very well. And those anecdotes about people just taking it as read that Wakefield did or said or wrote whatever without ever checking, and indeed somebody making that remark about measles and autism, absolutely staggering. But they, anecdotal as they are, they absolutely encapsulate the situation. And what you're describing now with the sort of financial resources and the messaging and everything else, what I want to ask you is, how the heck did you get your book out? Because not only have you managed to publish it, but prior to that, you were asking for the release of data and documents and whatnot that was, in effect, to some degree, classified. And given the sensitivity and all the stuff we've talked about up until now, how did you make that happen? And what were the challenges?
Well, I have to say, people who work in libraries are very friendly, very helpful. And as I said, because a lot of things I was reading in books I didn't believe, I decided to go to the libraries. I started obviously in Switzerland because that's where I was based, but then I invested in a research trip in the UK, and I started with the British Library looking for the historical documents, and then the National Archives to find out what the government had said. Now, anybody can walk into the National Archives in Kew Gardens in London, and they do a keyword search. Committee of Safety on Medicines, 1980. I'm really interested to find out what is going to come out with the MMR vaccine. It's precisely when Wakefield had that whole episode with social autism scare. And then you make a request. Sometimes the documents are closed, and then they make a consideration if they open them because you've made a request, even though it's before the 100-year mark. I mean, I've seen documents closed for 100 years for privacy reasons, but obviously when they do make them available, sometimes the names are listed. So often these people are dead and they're not alive anymore. But anybody can walk into the National Archives and do that. I didn't have to do anything special. The only pushback was some documents I asked for. I didn't get permission. Like I didn't get permission from the work compensation document, because the work compensation scheme had a lot of information about vaccine injury within the hospitals, and for whatever reason they didn't give me access to that. But I can try again later. So that information is available. And in the US as well, in the UK, I have to give you kudos, because when they say freedom of information, it really is free, contrary to Switzerland where you have to pay for it. And you pay sometimes up to 100 francs an hour for whatever you're asking for. And how did I get my book published? Well, I was very fortunate that because I was involved in this organization since 2021, which is called Réinfo Santé, we were basically a coalition of doctors and medical professionals and health professionals who were thinking that, well, if we get together, we'll have a stronger voice together to counter what's going on about COVID, these ridiculous policies, preventing treatment, etc. Didn't quite go that way, but at least we found each other. We felt less isolated. And in that context, I met up with a few people, and I ended up going to a conference in Stockholm in 2023. And during that conference in Stockholm, I was able to sit down with Robert Malone and his wife, Jill. And I actually had a prototype of my manuscript with me. He'd obviously just come out with that book, Lies My Government Told Me, that was printed with Skyhorse. Skyhorse was actually probably the publisher I was hoping I would be able to approach for this book, because again, it's not a book that exists already. It's really a compendium on a chronological basis of historical facts on vaccines. There's over 1,300 facts on vaccines. And Robert Malone and his wife were interested in my project and saw how much work I'd put into it. I had two different manuscripts, because I had one on vaccine safety and then one was the timeline. And he immediately acted basically like my agent. He contacted Tony Lyons from Skyhorse and said, "Hey, I've got this person here who's written this book. You should take a look at it." And then I sent the manuscript to Tony Lyons at Skyhorse, and the rest is history. But I mean, obviously it's a long process getting a book published, and I understand why people self-publish as well, because it gets out quicker. But for me, being a new author as well, I mean, I've self-published a book on the virus, which was the first book I wrote, because I thought if people are less scared of viruses, then they'll be less inclined to go and get injected with whatever we're told that we can inject. But it was making good connections, meeting the right people at the right time, basically, that helped me to get this book out. And obviously Tony Lyons and then Zoe O'Toole, who's a very important editor at Children's Health Defense, looked also at the manuscript, and because she was also enthusiastic about it and said, "Hey, this is an addition to information that we have on vaccines. It's not just like saying something we already know or it's regurgitated." And thankfully, with her help, we were able to get the final draft and get it to print.
Amazing story. I mean, I don't know what you'd say to this. It strikes me that had you not had those connections you describe and you'd gone to a publisher cold, what do you think the outcome would have been?
I think I would have been, I mean, I did go to do a writing course a couple of years before, and I was told that if you don't have a doctor who's writing it with you, forget it, we're not interested. So that would have been a serious handicap, obviously, as I'm not a physician or a scientist. If I hadn't had if I hadn't written a book, co-written it with someone who was in science, I don't think I would have been able to get any interest. I still would have sent my manuscript off to Skyhorse and see what my chances were. But it's true, the other publishers I contacted in the UK when I did my course with Bloomsbury, I believe it was, Bloomsbury, I think it was, sorry. They said outright, we're not going to look at it unless you have you're co-writing with a scientist or a doctor.
Okay, wow, well, yeah, no surprise there, I suppose. Just going back to the book you just showed up, it's very easy to make a case for the marketing of vaccines, or indeed other medical products, and indeed the sorts of control mechanisms that we saw put in place in 2020 almost all around the world, as being predicated on the threat presented by something that is transmissible. Going back to your original position on vaccines, that of being open-minded, is the very existence, or indeed the sort of pathogenicity of what is described as a virus, something that you've looked at all, sort of in relation to your vaccination research?
Absolutely. I actually started with this book on the viruses before I went and did the book on the vaccines, because I mean, I never wanted to do such a large, dense book, and I wanted to do something that was more friendly and approachable to parents. And I actually started with a virology course at the University of Columbia, learning about viruses, because I again knew nothing about viruses and was interested about the whole domain of virology. How do we define a virus? You know, what are the categorizations? And again, I found out, I was like, whoa, it's massive. Like, there are bazillions of viruses we have no idea about, and we're just focusing on the ones that we think cause disease and not looking at everything else. So yes, I would say part of the vaccine research was looking at viruses, because a lot of vaccines are obviously, as we know, against viral infections. And I would say the majority of them now are against viral infections. I mean, Gardasil is HPV is a virus. COVID obviously is a virus. The flu is a virus. You've got RSV is a virus. And I think there are more going to come out. And the way they can, again, I say they, but I say the authorities create this fear that viral infections are what make us sick, not looking at any other factors like environmental factors or what else is going on, you're immune depressed or etc. I think it's important that people understand that viruses are as important as bacteria, and that eminent scientists, again, it's not me saying this, but eminent scientists who have dared to say that viruses are super important to the evolution of humanity, to evolution of life, that there is no life without viruses. We shouldn't be fearing them. We should understand them better, absolutely. But we have simplified the concept just so it scares the crap out of people, instead of educating them on what are viruses and the fact that there are so many of them and that we only know a small amount. And how do we check for viruses? Because they're invisible. Neither you nor me have actually seen one. And most people have never and never will see one, because it's simply not in the capacity, and we haven't got access to an electron microscope. And even if we did, we're not even sure we'll be able to isolate one. So there is so much fear and ignorance around the issue of viruses, and that fuels the vaccine uptake, and that fuels the whole debate of, you have to get a vaccine because we have now this Frankenstein COVID variant. They call it Frankenstein already. That should tell you something. But they're always going to be able to come out with new variants, because that's the nature of viruses. They mutate. There's going to be different strains. But they're able to use every strain as a fear-mongering device to, again, try to get people to vaccinate. And it's really frustrating sometimes, because people are still have so much confidence in the public health authorities. And unfortunately, the public health authorities, as we mentioned, it's not just the regulatory agencies that have maybe got vested interest, but the public health authorities as well. I've discovered very high up people in our infectious disease department were being paid by Merck whilst they were working for the government. And this is just kind of okay, no one is scandalized by this. No one sees it as a potential conflict of interest. But when you have got the profit motive behind potential products that you can sell when you scare people, that breaks down the whole real discourse you're going to have about health. Because as you in the UK, you didn't see, here in Switzerland, we didn't see any communication during COVID about, how to stay healthy, how to boost your immune system, keep your vitamin D levels. No, they told us vitamin D has no significance in health. Stuff which is just scandalous. So viruses, I think you cannot look at vaccines without looking at viruses, just as you cannot look at vaccines without looking at biological weapons, because that's also a huge part of how vaccines have been developed, is through military dual-use research into biological weapons. So those kind of go part and parcel when you're doing analysis or an in-depth research into vaccines. But I do highly recommend that people go and understand a bit more about viruses, because they're only going to come out with more of them and try to use it as a scare tactic. And information is power. And if you don't get scared anymore, then you're impervious to their propaganda, which is, again, what it is. I mean, you're saying stay stronger with like kids' animations. They're really talking down to us like we're idiots. And they've been doing that for a long time with everything to do with vaccines. Even here in Switzerland, they use like little cartoons to try to explain things to us because, people are too stupid to understand it otherwise. But they don't give correct information. They don't empower people with information about health, because ultimately that's the most important resource we have after our time, if not maybe more important than our time, because our time is worthless if we don't have health to optimize the experience.
Yeah, exactly. No, you make very, very good points on the way in which fear is, first of all, sort of constructed or confected and then weaponized. And in fact, I mean, this will be the case everywhere, but it's so obvious in the UK that the people who fund or produce the pharmaceutical answer are the same people who are funding research into what are described as emerging diseases. I mean, it's just so blindingly obvious. And again, the sort of narrative surrounding the idea of a virus and what it may be and what it may do has, again, interestingly created a sort of resurgence in the terrain theory, exactly like we were talking about, the environmental considerations. So it will be very interesting to see where this goes. Now, what that brings me to, and I think we'll have to sort of conclude on this, is what would you advise or recommend or suggest that people can do? Because this is exactly, going back to the sort of the hairdresser conversation, or the flu vaccine. People do get, rightly so, very, very emotionally charged and philosophically too about this. And yet, we spoke about the Victorian period in England when there was the National Anti-Vaccination League, but it exists no longer. There are, organisations that have countering this sort of thing as part of their remit. Is there, to your knowledge, an organisation or organisations that are specifically sort of single issue on this kind of thing, or just in general terms, what would you recommend to people to do to help swing the pendulum the other way?
Well, I imagine there are local parents groups which are specifically dealing with issues of vaccination. I mean, I'm looking more at the general health groups, which look at health as a larger, like a larger perspective, larger image, which obviously the World Council of Health is one of the main ones, which is based in the UK, which have done fantastic work, have fantastic resources on their website. There's also Children's Health Defence, not just about vaccines, about health in general. But I think the most important thing for parents, for grandparents, because everyone is touched by the subject of vaccines now. Even if you're an adult, they're going to push you to get the flu vaccine, or they'll push you to get your update on your tetanus. I think it's really important that people read. And if they don't like reading, then watch a documentary. I mean, obviously there's Vaxxed, which is a documentary specifically about the cover-up in the CDC, about the unpleasant statistics on autism and vaccines. But there are loads of documentaries out there. There are great books. I would especially recommend Dissolving Illusions, as I said, by Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Bystrionic. I also very highly recommend this book by Aaron Siri, who is a fantastic attorney in the US who's worked with ICANN, who has written a fantastic book where he's a legal background. So he looks at evidence from a court legal perspective. And I think that people need to have conversations and not be afraid to have difficult conversations, but to ask questions, because I've had a lot of people who are, very strongly opposed to vaccines, and they'll get accusatory, like, oh, they're doing this, they're doing that, la, la, la. I think if you're going to have a conversation which is productive, you need to ask questions. Well, what do you think we should put in our body? What do you think is does it make sense to be putting these products in this? And don't you think that we should be testing all these vaccines on the schedule before we recommend them to babies? I think that's the way forward, is entering into a dialogue with questioning, with humility, with no accusations, but not being afraid to have those conversations. Because a lot of people just shut up about those conversations. Because, I mean, I've lost friends on this journey, this obviously, but that's okay. Life is about change. So, and it's important to have these conversations. It's important not to censor yourself. I've been doing that for years, where I would censor myself because I didn't feel like I should say anything because I'm not a scientist or anyone. But I think conversations are important, and it's okay to disagree. We're not all going to agree on the same thing, But I think if we can all agree that health of our children and of ourselves is our most important resource, and we don't want to threaten that, and if we're gonna try and do everything we do to preserve it, basically. So, but people have to spend time reading, because no matter how much you listen to someone just telling you something, if you don't actually go through the process of understanding and realizing yourself, it's not going to have the same impact. And often, unfortunately, that happens through tragedy. So either a vaccine injured kid and the parent who suddenly realizes, or in my case, my dad. But yeah, I think it's important that we have open conversations, even if we know we're going to disagree, but to be humble and to ask questions.
Absolutely. Very, very good advice, which I think will be passed far and wide. And you talk about being humble. Now, you have been far too humble, because I noted in your list of resources you didn't talk about your own book, but you're going to have to do so now. Now, the Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, I mean, it's very obvious from the discussion we've had that it is incredibly thorough, and it sounds like exactly the sort of thing that anyone who's listened to this interview not only should read, but should tell others about. Where can we get your book, Shaz?
So my book is available on Amazon, I believe, in the UK. I'm not sure there's other big platforms in the UK, but I'm also a very ardent supporter of local bookstores. So if you do have a local bookstore who you want to support, order it in, because they can order it from their distributor. But otherwise, Amazon is probably easy. And yeah, it's the vaccine. I also recommend getting little tabs, because it is dense. And I think there will be certain parts that you might want to refer to back. But yeah, that's where you can get it in the UK, and I believe in mainland Europe. But
Perfect.
Yep.
I'm sorry. No, that's great. I mean, that's really useful. Now, what about any other websites, social media? Is there anywhere else that we can sort of follow what it is you're continuing to do?
So I have a website that accompanies the book, which I'm updating slowly with new material. It's called theultimatevaccinetimeline.com. I also recently started a Substack where you can follow me, which is called Indie Researcher. So INDIE researcher.substack.com. And then I have a website where I publish information about health in general, but not vaccines. And that's called healthsciencesimplified.com. So yeah, I'm not very social media active, but those are the places where I share information. Where if you want to reach out to me and contact me, you can, and yeah, that's it.
Lovely. Okay, and for those of you dashing for a pad and paper, don't worry, that all these will be written down in the notes that accompany this interview. And on that note, we will have to draw to a close. But Shaz, it's been a fascinating journey through not just the research and indeed the results of your book, but also the stories that have sort of bookended it, and indeed the issues that you continue to confront, and your message. So thank you so much for joining me at UK Column, and I really do wish you well with everything that you're doing in life, and in particular with the book.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you've been doing with the UK Column. And also, I read your personal story. I thought it was very interesting about your background and why you left the police force. And I want to thank you for everything that you're doing. So thank you very much.